Hi, in this video we'll be looking at web channel layout filters and filter slices. In most web channel reports you'll have filters that drive just the contents of the report, but on occasions you may want to create global filters that affect all the content in a particular dashboard. For example, here I've got a company and a period range, and if I was to submit those, all the content in the tabs and the tiles below are refreshed with that particular company. For example, I'll set it to UK and resubmit the report, and now all the reports are showing UK details. In addition to that, there are filter slices, and the idea is that instead of selecting a value and hitting submit, you can simply select a particular, in this case, customer name, and the content is refreshed just for that customer name. With filter slices, it's also possible to multi-select by holding down the control key. Whether you use layouts or tiles, the same concepts apply. So on the second tab here we have tiles, but just as before, the filter values across the top here are being passed down. The way it works is that each filter has a name, and the reports under them also have filters, and if you give the filters the same name, the values will be passed down to the sub-reports. In the case of slices, the slices are actually a report in their own right, and what we do there is we give the output name of the slicer the same name as the filter that we want to synchronize with. For this video, we'll start by creating the customer sales report and the customer sales chart, and we'll just look at how the filters work for these two reports. After that, we'll create the layout filters across the top and then combine the two in a layout. After that, we'll revise that layout so that we can organize the content into tabs. After that's done, we'll look at filter slices and build up this content across the top here. Towards the end of the video, we'll also look at some of the styling. For example, here we've got a green style happening. Let's start the report now by creating the customer sales report. So in Publisher, select New, and the group will be, for this exercise, Train F5. And we'll give the report a code. I'm going to call it Customer Sales. Notice that the code's just abbreviation, and the title will be Customer Sales. Down the bottom we have Edit Query, so I'm going into the Query Builder, and from here we can select the product that we want to report out of. For this particular exercise I'll be using SAP Business One because it's got a concept of companies. So I've selected SAP Business One, and by default it has a company up the top. Now later on we're going to have this overridden by the layout filter that across the top. But for now, let's just select the default company. From the table list, I'm going to go to Sales, and up the top here we have the default filters. For this exercise, I'd like to display the company in the outputs because it will tell us later on if the company is being passed down correctly or not. So I'm dragging the company into the outputs, and next I'll select the customer code, customer name, and I'm also going to display the period by dragging that filter into the outputs, and from the list I'll look for the profits. So here's the basis of my report, and the report mode is Summary Report. So there's my data. I'm going to press OK now and Apply, and I'll go across to the Links tab and copy the top link to the report. Now I have copied the link to the report, I can paste it into our browser, and here's our filters across the top, and if I submit the report, here's the report. And if I change the company, there's our new company. Before we go further, I'd like to explain how filters work, because it'll help you later on when we're creating the layouts. So here we have our filters across the top, and each filter has a name. So if I was to, on the URL address, pass in a new value for a particular filter name, it would override it. So let's go back to Publisher and edit the query, and you'll see across the right hand side that each filter has a name. Now by default these are given an arbitrary code, but you can edit them. For example, the period at the moment, if I change the name, there it is there. Let's have a look at the customer code. So here it says CUSCOD for the customer code. So if I was to go to this report in the web channel and type in FLT customer code equals, and for example C23900, and then do an ampersand FLT customer code underscore 2 for the 2 value, and also set that to C23900. And if I hit enter, you can see that the customer code is now pre-populated with the code that I entered in up the top here. This is the mechanics of how the filters work. So later on, when we have our layout filter, it's going to push those filter values onto the lower content like this. Let's clean up this report now by removing some of the filters that we don't want changed. So we come back into Publisher, and if we go to the Query Builder, you can see that if we right click on a filter, we can hide them. So I'm just hiding the document code, the document entry, but I'm leaving the customer code and the period visible because we may want to, just in these initial stages, view what's been passed down. Now I'll create a second report, and this will be for the chart. Because the second report is very similar to the first, what I'll do is clone the customer sales report, which is number 2, and let's just edit it, the data set in Query Builder. Because it's a chart, I don't want to clutter the chart up with too much detail, so I'm going to take out the company and the customer code. So we'll just have the periods and the gross profit for that filter range. So this is what the data set looks like, and press OK. And what we'd like to do is set the report to default to a chart. And if we go to the chart settings, you can see we can choose the type of chart that we'd like to display. In this case, I think column will be fine. So I'm just going to press OK there, and if I come across to the links, I should be able to view that particular report. So here's our filters across the top again, and if I submit it, there's our chart. So now we have 2 reports. What I'd like to do is now move into the second stage where we create the layout filters across the top, and then we'll display these reports underneath. So it's this section here that we'll be looking at now. So back into Publisher, and what we're going to do is create a new report, and this report is just simply going to prompt the user for a company and a period range. So I'm going to press New, and just as we did before, we'll put it into the same group, Train F5, and the code for the report is going to be main, because this will be the main entry point for the report. And we'll give the report a title, so I'll call it Web Channel Filters and Slices. And we could then come down to edit query, and from the product list we'll go back to SAP Business 1. Now we can select a table, for example sales, to go off and get the company and the period details, but there are quite a few transactions in sales, and really all we're after is the company and the period. So let's have a look to see if there's a table that better suits our needs. So there is a table called companies, so I'm going to use that. So there's our company filter up the top, and you can see this is a very light table. It's just got a few details about what the current company is. So I'm just going to output a field, but this is not going to be used. It's just the filters up the top here. So what the user will see is company, and database and company, again, we don't really need to show them those because it's just the company and the period that we want them to enter. Now, there are no fields called period in this table, so I need to manufacture a period column. So I'm going to go right click, and from the other menu I'm going to create a period filter. Now later on this will become important, these filter names. At the moment this filter is called period, but the reports that we just created earlier actually have a different name for this period. But we'll leave it as it is now so that we can see what happens if you don't synchronize the periods. Now I'm going to put in some defaults for this period. Because I'm using a demonstration database, I'm going to have to go back in time. So normally what you do is just come into the periods and say, for example, go to the start of the year like this, and that way the periods will move as time passes. But as I'm using a demonstration database, I'm just going to hard code these periods in. So I'm going to go 2006 to the end of the year. Okay, now we have our basic query defined. Let's see what it looks like when we copy the link. So press apply, copy the link, and we'll view that in the browser. So there's our filters across the top, but you'll notice that the company selection is a drop-down lookup. What I'd like to do is create a combo box so we can simply select from the combo box. So we'll go back and change that. So go back into Query Builder, and if I click on the company and right click, go to options, you'll see that there are some checkboxes to turn the filters into a drop down pick list. So I'm just going to turn that on and press OK and apply. Good, so there's our companies in a drop down list. Let's move on to the next stage now, where we're going to turn these into layout filters that push down to lower content. So we'll go back into this main query, and this time we'll go to the report tab, and there's a section called layout. Let's enable that and press edit. Now there are two types of layouts, one's called a dashboard and one's called tab. Let's leave this on dashboard. I'm going to press new, and by default it displays its own content in the first section. This will be the filters across the top, and then I'll press new again, and this will be for the sub-content down below. So in the second section what we want to do is display the sales by customer. So from this list here I'm going to select that particular report. So here's our customer sales report. So now it's put the code for that report in there. There are some settings here that are quite important for making layouts work. Here we have our filters, and then here we have our report. What we'd like to do is say that this top section is just for prompting only, and we'd like to submit it by default. This is quite important, this submit by default. And then for the second section, what we want to do is select display after submit button clicked and submit by default. Let's have a look at the report as it is now. So I'm pressing apply and copy, and we refresh that page. There's our company's periods up the top, and if we were to change the company to UK, you can see we've displayed the company in the column, so it's easy to see what's going on. If I resubmit that, yes, that's worked. And the reason it worked is because the filter name for company and this customer sales report has the same name. But the periods are a different matter. For example, if I was to say that the period was from period 1 to period 2, and I submit that, notice that the periods are still going up to period 12. These haven't been synchronized. So let's go back into the report and have a look at the filter name that was used for the period, and we'll match it up on the layout filter at the top. So I'm just going to close the main report, and we'll go back to customer sales, and we'll open up the query. Now if we have a look at the period, you can see that it's given a name of year period code. So I'm just going to right click and copy that name, because we're going to go back to that main report and apply that same name to the periods there. So I'm just going back into the main report, and there's our period, which is up the top here, and currently it's got a name of period which doesn't match up. So I'm just going to right click and we'll change the name to be the same as those sub-reports. Don't get confused between names and descriptions. The descriptions are what the user sees, and the names are what we programmatically synchronize on. So now I've changed that to be the same as the sub-reports. I can apply that. Just need to refresh this page. Currently it's showing Australia, and if I was to change the period, we can see yes, it has indeed worked. During the initial phases where you're creating the reports, it's always a good idea to display a few more columns, just so you can confirm that the filters really are passing down to the sub-content. The other thing you could do is actually display some of the filter values in the title, but I'll show you how this is done later. The next thing I'd like to do is to reorganize this layout so it uses tabs. So we have a customer sales tab, and then we have a sales to tab. So this report will then appear under there, and the layout filters will push down all the filter values into the sub-content, and then we'll bring this chart into play as well, and then the slices across the top. Okay, let's come back into Publisher now, and because we want to organize this and this into a tab layout, what we'll do is we'll create another report, and its sole purpose is to organize these reports into tabs. So again, we'll call it train F5, and the code will be layout tabs. Now the title itself won't be seen anywhere because it's just organizing report that organizes other reports. The query itself is not important because we're just organizing other reports into tabs. So I'm just selecting system and company details and outputting the company name. So it's a nice simple query that's very quick. Now we come into the report tab and select layout, edit, and this time from the style drop down list we'll select tab. The first tab, I'm just click on new, and down here we have the tab title. I'm going to call this customer sales, and the second tab I'll call this sales to. Normally you'd create tabs with purchasing or profit and loss, etc., but this is a training exercise, so I'm just going to repeat basically the same content in both tabs. Now you can see that there's a report code that goes into each tab. This is the report that you would like to show under that tab. So here's the report code. If I just go to the lookup button, I can then choose the report I want to display in this tab. Display customer sales, and I'll do the same thing in the second tab as well. As we go along, I'll add more and more complexity to these tabs, but we're building it up step by step just to make it a little bit simpler to follow. Okay, so now I've got my tabs defined. I'm going to press OK and apply, and we'll copy the link to see what we've got currently. There's our customer sales tab, our sales to tab. Now what we'd like to do is actually have these reports submit by default. So you can see that they're just currently waiting for us to click the submit button. So what I'll do is I'll go back to that sales report, and so here's our sales report, and I could select here, for example, submit by default, and then collapse after submit. That's one way we could have done it. So I'll just refresh that page, and you can see now it's gone straight into the report, didn't wait for user interaction with the filters, and it's collapsed that filter section up the top there. Right, so we have our tabs now. What we'd like to do is combine it with the layout filters. So let's go back to our main report where the layout filters were, and if we have a look at its layout, currently what it's doing is it's got the filters across the top, and then it goes straight to the customer sales report. What we'd like to do now is replace that with the tab report. So let's go into the lookup, and from the list select layout tabs. Notice that it's submit by default, so I'll press apply, and then we'll view the report as it is now. It's looking much better now. We've got our layout filters across the top, and now we've got our tabs, and just as before, we can change the company and have that come down through the tabs into the lower content. I think we're ready now to add a header section across the top of these layout filters. So when we add that header section across the top, what we want to do is remove the title bar on the prompts across the top and then add that header section. So let's do that now. So we'll come back into Publisher, and here's the main report. The first thing I'll do is I'll say that on the prompts we don't want to show the title bar. Then I'll come to enable header, and I'll just press edit. Headers are made of HTML, and if you don't have any HTML skills, what you can do is select the reference button, and from the list under Publisher there are some pre-built templates. So I'm just going to select the custom report header template. What this basically does is takes whatever the title of your report is and produces a header for you. So I'm just going to press OK on that and apply, and we can now refresh the report. So there's our header coming in, and we've got our current account, sign out, and there's our prompts across the top here again. Good, now I think we're ready for the next stage, and that is to bring in some slices. So if we go back to the original example, what we'll be doing is creating a report that lists all the customer names, with the idea that we're going to select them and have the report content refreshed based on that click event. And what we'll do is under this tab is create yet another layout where we'll have the slicer across the top and the customer sales report and chart brought in. So we'll be saying that the first section is all the way across the top, and then we'll have two sections side by side, just so we can see how we can organize layouts. Of course, we could have used tiles for this as well, but in this exercise we'll look at layouts first. So the first step of this next stage is to create another report that will list the customer names. So I'm just going to click on New and select the same group again, and I'm going to call this report Customer Slicer. Come down to Edit Query, and just as we've done before, we'll select the product that we want to pull the customer names out of, in this case SAP Business One. What I'm going to do is I'll select the sales table that we were working on before. The reason I'm doing this is because when we select the company and the period range, what I'd like to do is just show customers that are active for that company and that period range, so that we don't get too many customers appearing across the top. If I didn't do this, I'd probably get all the customers from the beginning of time. So in this way we can cut down the list somewhat. Now you may think, well, let's use the customer code, but the customer code's a little bit cryptic for most users, and they probably don't know what that code means. So instead of using the code, I'm going to use the customer name. You can see the output has a name as well, and this is going to be important later on because this name needs to be synchronized with the filters of the other reports. Just need the customer name, and if we preview that, yes, that looks good. So I'm going to press OK and apply. So we'll copy the link to the report, and it'll just be that simple list of customer names. The next step is we'll create a layout where we take the customer filter slices and we combine it with these reports, these two reports here. So let's create another report, and give it a code, and this will be the customer layout. The query is not important for this report because it's just a layout that combines other reports. So I've just selected that company name again. And just as we've done before, we'll come into report and we'll enable a layout. And this layout, select new, and we're using the dashboard, not tabs. And so what would like in the first section across the top is actually the customer slicer. Now to start with, what we'll do is we'll just put it on the left hand side, and then later on I'll show you how you can move it across horizontally across the top. So the first section is going to be the customer slicer, so I'm selecting that report from the list. The next section will be the sales report, and the next section will be the same customer sales report but the chart. So I'm just copying and pasting that and putting number 2 on the end. You can see that we can select the content type, which is a report, and then if we haven't specified any defaults in that report, we can even override them here to say, look, this particular report, we want to chart it. Now let's have a look at these checkbox settings. So this is going to be our slicer. So what we want to do is say it's submit by default, and next we'll select use row selection to refresh other sections. So that means when we click on it, it's going to refresh these other sections. So we'll click on that. Next, come to the other reports, and these ones we're going to have display after submit button clicked and submit by default, and the same for the chart. Alright, let's have a look to see what the report looks like at this stage. So there's our slicer up the top. Now it still has prompts, so we need to get rid of those. Then underneath that we have our customer sales table, and underneath that we have a chart. Now obviously the chart height needs to be adjusted as well. So in one hit, what we'll do is suppress these filters across the top, and we'll tell the report to display the customer sales table alongside to the right hand side, and then the chart along the bottom. So we'll come back to the customer layout and we'll go into layouts. So this section across the top, we'll say, look, we want to hide the prompts. So that'll get rid of that section across the top. Next, we wanted that second report on to the right of this selection. So what I'll do is I say that there are 2 columns in this layout, and you can see it's automatically adjusted the layout. Currently this first section is taking the whole row. That's because the checkbox span columns is on, so we just turn that off, and you can see now it's adjusted it again. So we'll get our slices there and the report on the right hand side. If we were to leave these settings as they are now, it'd be almost a 50-50 split between these two. But really the customer names aren't that wide, so I'd like to adjust the width. So I'll say that the width will be 20% for the customer names, and for the second item I'll say that's the remaining 80%. Then we come down to the chart at the bottom, which will be displayed across the length here. And what we'll say is we'd like to make that at least 500 pixels high. Press OK and we'll view the report. I'll need to set the width of the chart to 100%, but let's just click on the filter slicer and see what happens. So as I'm selecting the values, nothing is being synchronized in these other reports. That's because we're using the slicer on the customer name, and there are no customer name filters in these other reports. So what we'll need to do is go into customer sales and customer sales 2 and actually create a filter so that this can be passed across. So let's go back into the layout and adjust the chart width. So what we need to do with the chart width is simply say that it should span the full length of the column, and we'll leave the column width as auto. Okay, that's done now. So Now we can add the additional filters for the customer name. So come into customers, and you can see there's only a filter for customer code on this report. So what we want to do is add in a filter for customer name, and that way the slicer will have a target and can influence this report's customers. So there's the name, which happens to be the same as the slicer. So that's the first report, and I'll come into the second report and do the same there. So we take the customer name and put it up into the filters and save that report. So let's refresh the report again, and this time when we click on a customer name, it is synchronized, so that table on the right hand side did display correctly, and the chart down the bottom here as well. It's sometimes hard to tell that they really are synchronizing, so what I'll do is go to this report here and actually display whatever the current customer name filter is in that title bar across the top. Let's come into sales customer, and here we have the title of the report, but the actual report title itself is this second one here. So let's just put in customer sales, and to display the filter values, just come across to the lookup button, and from the filters selection we can choose what we want to display. So I just want to display the customer name, and I'll choose the first one from the list. Press apply, and we'll refresh the report. So by default we're getting all the customers, and once we select one, you can see it's now appearing in the title bar up the top here. So if I select two, the two will appear. We're ready now to move to the next stage, where we change this layout to make it look somewhat better. If we look at the original example, you can see there's the slicer horizontally across the top, and then we've got the sales report and the chart on the right hand side. So let's have a look at that layout now. So we'll come back into Publisher, and if we go to the Customer Layout Report tab and edit the layout, so there's our slicer, and currently the layout looks like this, so number 1, 2 and 3. So we'd like to change that so that the customer slicer will go all the way across the top. So we're going to click on span columns, and then if we come down to the chart, we'll just take off span columns there so that it looks like this, the slicer all the way across the top, and then the report and the chart. We also need to take off those column width details, so I'm going to set the column width back to auto so it takes up the full length, and for the customer sales, what I'd like to do is set that to auto as well, and the chart to auto, so that they take 50-50 on either side of that layout. Now we come to the part where we need to tell the slicer to display horizontally. To do that, what we need to do is come into the URL parameters and drop in a parameter called table horizontal. Now it is case sensitive, and what we're doing is saying table horizontal equals 1, or we could say yes. It doesn't really matter. If you were to turn it off, it would be 0 or N for no. Let's have a look at the content as it is now. So I'll refresh the page. There's our customer slicer across the top, and when we click it, sure enough, the table's showing just that customer, and the chart is also refreshing as well. But there's a bit of space between the slicer and this content here. We can get rid of that by actually setting the height of this slicer area. Now if we didn't want customer name to appear there, we could go into the slicer and tell it not to display column headers, but I think that's working well for me, so I'm going to leave it. So let's come back into the report that does the customer layout, and we'll edit it, and we'll set the height for that slicer. So here we've got auto height. I'll just take that off, and I'm going to set it to 35 pixels high, and refresh the page. You can see that 35 pixels is not quite high enough, so I'll need to go back and adjust it again. So let's adjust that to 50 pixels high, and that should be just enough to display all the customers in one line. Yes. Now what we're going to do is go back to our main report, and on this tab here, instead of just displaying this report directly to customer sales, we're going to redirect it to this layout, the customer layout. So we have our slices and the report and the chart. So let's come back to Publisher, and then we'll go to our Layout tabs report, and we'll go into its layout, and sure enough, at the moment it's going directly to customer sales. What we want to do is tell it to go to the customer layout report that we were just working on previously. Alright, so we'll press OK, and now we'll refresh that report. So there's our layout filters across the top, and there's our slicer. So if I was to change the company, the slicer itself also is affected by the company selection and the period range. And sure enough, it's passed down the filter values to the sub-reports. And now I'm going to try the slicer as well. So yes, that's working as well. Before we move on to Sales Number 2 tab, what I'll do is just remove this title here from the slicer, as it's taking up room and I don't think it needs to be displayed. So that was on the Customer Slicer report. So let's go to Customer Slicer, and if I go to the Tables tab, I can remove the Show Title button. Another good idea is to remove the padding around these reports. So if you ever find that the reports are just a little bit too much padding around them, just click on Remove Padding. This becomes important later on when you use tiles. Let's refresh that report, and now we've got the slices without the title above them. Right, so the next stage is to create this Sales 2 report, and it's very similar to the first one in that we just display the content in tiles. So what I've done is taken the chart data and put it in table form, in chart form, and then I've created another report that takes the profit by day and displays them in a calendar, so that we can get a feel for what days in the calendar have the most profits. Let's start by building this calendar report. So come back to Publisher, and the calendar report is very similar to the chart report. So what I'm going to do is clone that chart report. So it'll be Customer Sales 2.2. So I'll just rename that to say Calendar, and I'll edit the query. Now currently it's showing the data by period. So what I want to do is remove the period, and I'd like to put in the actual sales date. So I'm going to do a search on date, and I think I'll use this one here, the document date. So if I preview that, so there are the days, and there's the profit for that particular day. Now because we've got the filters up the top here, whatever company, period, and customer name we choose will affect this report, because the filter values will be pushed down to it. So there's our calendar report, and what I want to do is go to the charts and say that we don't want to display a column chart, but a calendar chart by default. And I can come to the report tab and just check that that says chart as well. So I'm just going to press apply, and I'll copy the link to this report. There's our filters across the top, and if we submit it, the data has been shown in a calendar format. Basically it's a grayscale, so as the numbers go higher, in this particular case they're turning a darker blue. So when you've got quite a bit of data in there, you can actually see patterns in this calendar. Okay, so now we're ready to create a dashboard that looks something like this. Let's go to the Sharperlight index page, and from the selection select dashboards. I'm going to select new. We'll create a new dashboard, and it's given an arbitrary code. This is the dashboard group, so I'm going to set that to train F5, and the code is going to be called sales. I'll just press save at this stage, and you can see there's just one tile on the screen that we can move around and place. So let's put the content in this tile. So I'm going back into the settings, and where it says content URL, we can select from a list of reports or other dashboards. From the publisher list, we'll go down to train F5, and from this list here we want to get the customer sales 2 report. The first report that we did has too many columns and really won't fit in this tile very well, so I want to cut down report. And what I'd like to do is display that in table form without any prompts, and then here's the link to the report. Let's press save and see what that looks like. So I'm just going to give it a little bit more height so we can see all the content. Now if this content was too long, what I could do is come in and turn on scroll bars like this, so that if it extended beyond the tile we could at least adjust that. Alright, so let's create another tile now and display the chart. So I'll press new, and the content will be the same as last time, but this time go into the charts and select column. Press save, and it's put it down below here, but I'm just going to drag it up and place it alongside the other tile. Now with tile placement, previously what would happen with that, if you put a tile over the top of a tile, it would push it out of the way and reorganize the tiles so that they didn't overlay each other. But in the newer versions you can actually overlay them on top of each other. This is because the packing options have been turned off. So I'm just going to go into settings and page, and you can see that pack tiles vertical and horizontally have been turned off. So you could actually put a tile on top of another, and you could have little KPIs appearing along inside this chart, for example. And then you could remove the title bar by just setting its height to 1 pixel, and you could start using this always on top option as well. Okay, so now we want to put the calendar at the bottom, so I'm just going to create another tile and I'll select the content. So this is the customer sales calendar report, and without prompts, and I'll just select calendar from the list and press OK. So let's make that a little bit wider so we can see the rest of the calendar. Now don't worry that the content's not all displayed at the moment. If we just come back in and save, the content will refresh. Now for this particular report, I really don't want the title bars in the tiles as well as in the report, so I want to get rid of those so that we make the dashboard a little bit tighter. So I'm just going to come in and say, look, the title bar is actually very thin, 1 pixel, and instead of going into customer sales 2 report and unticking show the title, I'm just going to use a URL parameter called show title, and it is case sensitive, equals n for no, and I'll do the same for the other reports. So there, it's gone, and you can see that there's just a very thin line up the top there for the title bar. So let's go and do the same for the other reports and copy that in on the end, and this one down the bottom here as well. If you remove the borders from these tiles, you could make so that the tile just shows the content with no borders, and if you do set the title bar to white on white, it will look quite clean without these borders. Okay, so this content's looking pretty good. I'll just adjust the height a little bit more. If you do set the title bars to be very thin, you'll find that you'll just have to grab that very thin slice of a title bar to be able to move them. Now that content's ready, we'll go back into Publisher and we'll adjust the Layout Tabs report to include this report now. So I'm going to Layout Tabs and let's edit its layout. So the first layout is showing the customer layout that we worked on with the slices, and now we'll replace the content for the second tab to include this report, this dashboard that we were just working on. So by default the content will refer to a report, but in this case we want to change it to dash page, and then from the selection list we'll look for that report, that dashboard that we just created. So it was train F5 and there it is there. Okay, so let's press OK, apply, and we'll view the report as it stands now. So there's our customer sales and there's our sales too. And of course if I was to change the company, even though these are tiles, you would still push down into them. If we wanted to apply the slicer technique to tiles, all we'd do is create another tile and it would have the slicer, and we'd need to use a special parameter to indicate that that tile was a slicer driving the other tiles. So these tiles aren't really set up with slicers, but if we were to designate one of them as a slicer, you would come into the settings and you would put this parameter on the URL address, which is row select filter equals y or 1. So that would turn it into a slicer that affects the other tiles. Okay, so now we're moving towards the end of the video, and what I'd like to look at now is just some styling. At the moment the tiles are quite blue, and what I'd like to do is change the look so that it has a green look. Now there are some cascading styles, there's CSS styling, but there is a more simpler version where just by setting a parameter on the URL address, for example style equals green, all the content of the dashboard is turned into a green style. So at the moment it's style equals green, but you can see that there's still borders around a lot of these reports. So if I change the style to style equals flat minus green, it's still a green look, but the borders around these reports has been removed. If I was to change it to, for example, flat grey, we'd get a grey look to the report. But as you may have guessed, typing the URL address up here is not always an option. What we'd like to do is have that style already inbuilt into the main report that we've produced. So let's go with the green style, and we'll also need to change the color of this chart here so that it has a green look as well. So let's come back into Publisher and we'll go to the main report, and on the Reports tab you can see that there's some URL parameters that we can put on the report by default. So in here I'm going to type in ampersand and style equals flat minus green, so that report will always have a green style. So I'll apply that, and I'll just get rid of this parameter up the top here, and you can see now by default it's got a green look. Next is the chart, so we'll come back to Publisher and I'm going to sales number 2, which is the chart, and we'll come across to the chart, and you can see here that we've got some different color themes for charts that can change the sets of colors, so we could have a grey look, a red look or a blue look, But what I'd like to do is specify my own colors. So I'm going to customize the colors. The first one is red. So if I was just to press apply at the moment, you can see that now the chart is using that first color for the first in the series of that data. So what I'd like to do is set that to green. So I'll go back, specify, and I think this green here looks very good, so I'll just pinch that color there and put it in the first slot, because we're not going to reach down to here. We don't have much in the way of data, so just override that red with green. Now I could have gone into the lookup and then chosen a particular shade of green, but I think this green looks fine. So I'll press OK and apply, and we'll refresh that report. So there's our chart now in green, and also here. Now before we close off, there are occasions where users don't particularly understand that they can click on these slices to refresh the content, and it may be better on occasions to actually show them a checkbox. So they may not know that they hold down the control key to select more than one customer name, but if there's a checkbox there, it's probably more obvious to them. So let's, before we close this video, turn these customer name slices into a series of checkboxes that the user can click on. So let's go into Publisher and have a look at the slicer. So here's our slicer, and in the query we have the customer name. So very simple, nothing complicated at all. But to turn this into a checkbox, what we need to do is create an expression that builds the checkbox. So I'm just going to add expression, and from this list of templates, what we can do is do a search on slicer. Now there's a simple slicer and an advanced slicer. I recommend you use the advanced one. Now here's our template. What we need to pay attention to is the slicer value and the slicer label. It's possible, for example, to have the customer code as the value that's passed and then have the label as something different. Remember that we had to add the customer name filter to everything because the slicer was using the customer name. Well, if we had used this technique, what we could have done is shown the customer name and use the checkbox to pass the customer code instead. But for this exercise, we'll just set them both to the same thing. So I'm just going to delete that example there, and we'll come up and we'll select the customer name, and also over here as well, so the customer name will be in the label as well. Now this content here is simply building up a checkbox in HTML, and it's taking these two values that we've created above here and just recalling them and setting them in the HTML content. So just press OK to that, and there's our expression. Now before we run this, remember that the output name was being passed to the filters of the same name. So really we want this expression now to take on that role. So it has to be called this name here. So I'm just going to copy that name and come up to the new expression, and it will take on that role now. And I'll change its description to something better. So I'll call that just customer. Now the problem is that these both have the same name now, so I'll just need to change this one to call it customer X, and we'll go back into the expression and we'll say it's referring to the column called customer X. Now slices only show one column or one value. If I leave both of these visible at the moment, it's going to be quite confusing. We'll have a checkbox and then we'll have the same name repeated twice. So we need to hide this. We need to hide this column, and we'll press OK and apply. So let's refresh the report, and now you can see there are some checkboxes across the top, and if I was to select microchips, it would just be microchips, and then if I select the second one, that would be in combination. Now the drawback with the checkboxes is that to just select one at a time, I'd have to uncheck the previous checkbox. So in that regard, the first pattern was actually superior. In closing, let's review what we've covered in this video. What we learnt is that filters have names, and those names can be parameterized, so that if we created a layout filter with names that were the same as the filter names of the subcontent, we could, for example, hit submit and have those filters override the filters of the subcontent. Of course, the subcontent could have its own unique filters that aren't synchronized, and we could even show a filter area up here where they could further change the values. Next, we looked at filter slices, and the idea there was that simply by touching the slicer, we could have the value passed down, or if we checked on them, we could multi-select the filters and have those passed down. In this regard, the filter slices are actually outputs, and we would give the output the same name as the filters that we wanted to synchronize on in the sub-reports. And then we looked at a bit of styling. That concludes web channel layout filters and slices.